Culture is an interesting element because we live in a world where things are so much closer now. It's much more difficult for you to ignore the fact that there's other cultures that are surrounding. So the idea of how you're going to interact or how you're going to get along with other people ends up being very important. And a lot of businesses now are going international, so you need to be able to find ways to be able to work with other cultures and being able to recognize other cultures and be able to work within them. So we're going to focus on defining culture to start with. We're going to look at some co-cultures, and we're going to look at this idea of prejudice. So the first thing we're going to look at is defining culture, and this includes a lot of different types of um, influences like nationality, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, physical and mental abilities, and age. So we might find that you might have a culture that's related just to somebody's disability. So I know that there is a deaf culture. That was one I'm familiar with in particular. And then, if you have a certain, there are things that are oriented towards women and certain things that are oriented towards men. We do have things that are oriented towards religion. So there are different cultures that hang out within the culture that we currently reside in. So culture could be where you come from and the culture where you grew up, and it could be a community that perhaps you belong to that becomes another part of the culture. So we can take more of a broad definition of what culture is. So the first thing to look at is it's coherent, meaning that it's connected. It means it's an overview, and it relates to beliefs, attitudes, values, practices. So we look at those pieces, and these are oftentimes how ideas are shared. They're going to be shared with other people in a larger group, and these beliefs, attitudes, values, and practices are going to be passed down because you've been socialized into believing these elements. So we talked before about the Bronfenbrenner model, where you have lots of different elements that influence culture, how you grow up, how you learn your belief systems, all those elements. So culture is learned. It's learned. It's a process that starts at birth, and you continue through the process as you learn history and you learn traditions. When it comes to a lot of the big elements that happen in life, you'll notice some differences between what it looks like when people get married, when they give birth. There's celebrations that happen around major life events in people's lives, and so those end up being represented within a culture. So these are all shared by the larger culture. Okay, so first of all, it's learned. The second one that it is it's communicated. So each culture has its own practices, and like I just mentioned, you have different celebrations and elements that go along with that. So they're communicated oftentimes through stories. So cultures have their own stories that go along with it. So culture is also layered. It has a lot of traditions, a lot of beliefs that go along with it, and elements that suggest that something is important. So I look at lots of movies that relate to culture. One I think of often is Fiddler on the Roof, and that one has a very strong culture about how relationships are formed, and that a matchmaker has to make the match between you and the person that you're going to spend the rest of your life with. Or if I have a friend that came from, I think he's from Iran. I think maybe Iran. And he had an arranged marriage. So there was an agree upon relationship with this person from a young age, and then he went back home and he married her and he brought her back here. Unfortunately, I can't say that he's super happy in his marriage, but what I can say is, that he followed through with the ritual and the tradition. There was an agreed upon situation. They've had children, but she sort of stays with people that are part of her culture, and he lives in the world of American culture. So he has, lived and celebrated that for a very long time. So there is almost like a separation between the two, and I'm sure that there's some element of the kids that tie them together, because the kids have to live in both worlds. If their mother's living in one and the kids are living in another. I have another gentleman I used to train with, and he's from the Hmong culture, and he had to pay a bride's price. So he basically, he jokes because he's got quite the sense of humor. And he talked about how he paid for his wife, and apparently culturally, if he wasn't happy with her, he could have, asked for his money back. We always joke, but anyway, culturally, she's supposed to be subservient. She's supposed to serve. If other, and the only time that actually happens is if other people from the culture are at their house, and if other people of their culture is at their house, then they follow the rules. And when the people are gone, the rules are out the window. So there's no way that she would continue to live by that specific one. So I think, you look at these traditions and these values, and that they're different in that a lot of people here, get married for love or for money, I guess. But there's definitely this idea of being able to pick who you're going to marry rather than it being picked for you. So definitely differences in that particular tradition. I just think that's one aspect to look at. Now, the idea that culture is lived suggests that there really isn't a part of who you are that isn't impacted by it. If you live, some cultures are kind of over, they kind of encapsulate every part of who you are. So I think about some cultures like Judaism and Islam, where the religion is just a huge part of who you are and how you live. I think Catholicism for some people is the same. I mean, you do it all the time. That is your social group. Those are your social peers. They're the ones that you interact with. They're also the people that you would generally get married to. So these are all elements that happen. We also can look at this idea of there being personal pride. So identifying yourself with that culture shows pride. A person can dress in a certain way if a woman wears a hijab, or a man wears a yarmulke on his head, or there's a scarf that's worn over the head. It's sort of reflecting your religion. It's something that you're kind of wearing, and it's sort of showing your beliefs to other people. At the same time, it's part of how you live your life. And it's also a part of self-expression. So this decision to recognize your specific religion and your celebration, that's another aspect of this that becomes important in how you experience culture. So cult cultures are another interesting element. There's a lot of people that live in our culture, in American culture, that are multiple cultures. In Colorado, we are we are a melting pot for sure, but very heavy in Hispanic. So there's a lot of majority. In the past was European white. They call them what's the word for it? It's a WASP. White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Now, I'm not Protestant, but the idea and the ideology kind of came from that same location. And this idea of prominent or predominant white is going to be changing by the year 2045. That's the suggestion, that white will no longer be will be the minority by 2045. And it's just about just a number of different people, and there's some people that don't like that. They don't like the fact that they're losing their power, or that it shouldn't happen. But the truth is that, you know, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants also came to America, and they weren't the predominant culture. There was the Native Americans that were predominant culture. So all of us outside of the Native Americans are not indigenous. We didn't come here. I mean, my family's been here, at least on one side of my family, since I'm a what they call a DAR, daughter of the American Revolution. I would qualify, I'm not registered, but I would qualify to be a daughter of the American Revolution twice, based on my mom's side of the family. So that just means that my family's been here for a long time, but I can't say, I mean, everybody that's probably part of my family has immigrated here in some form or another. So this idea of this only being one culture being dominant, I mean, it doesn't necessarily make sense. And know that people in general don't want to let go of control. If they're in power, there is this desire to maintain power that's a natural inclination of human beings, it seems. So yeah, so the minorities are going to start to have increased power. And when you have two cultures that maybe a person's American and they're also Hispanic, or they're American and Asian, or American and, I mean, whatever the combination is, then we actually have co-cultures. And that person gets an opportunity to decide what views, traditions, and values they have. I know I was watching I think I just looked it up. I think it's episode 240. It's from 2000, and I think it is called, oh gosh, I wish I could remember. I was just looking at it yesterday. It's like Blamed or something like that. Anyway, it was a situation where a Middle Eastern family came to the United States, and apparently the sister in the family started dating a man that was not part of her culture. And the family was upset and felt that she had disgraced the family. And the older brother killed his sister and was in court for that situation. And you think, okay, so how does the court decide? Does the court decide, well, he's doing it based on his own culture. He made the decision to kill somebody in a culture where that's not acceptable. Well, where he comes from, that's a perfectly acceptable belief in his system. So it becomes a situation where you've got the co-cultures clashing. I know a lot of times, you know, people will choose to continue with some beliefs or whatever around their culture, and people will give them a hard time for making that decision. It's a person's choice. We live in a country that says that it's your choice. So how do you accommodate that? And then co-cultures communication, oftentimes that happens when the underrepresented connects with the represented. So this kind of communication needs to happen. So there's this idea of intersectionality, where there's a complex combination of cultures, identities, and experiences, and they speak out from their different perspectives. So, you know, those are sort of shifts that you have between the two. And then we have this idea of practices, and there's three main pieces that kind of fall along with this. The first one looks at this idea of communication, assimilation, where someone's trying to fit in with the dominant culture. You have accommodation, where people are trying to gain acceptance from the dominant culture, but they're behaving in a way that feels good to them or feels right to them. Or they can use separation, where they're completely creating a distance between them and the other groups. So you might see that element that happens as well. This idea of in-group and out-group, I think we've run into before, but in-group means that they look like you, they act like you, they have similar beliefs to you, so they end up being part of your group. You see them as being similar to you. Out-groupers are people that look different, act different, have different belief systems to you. And so those end up being out-groupers, and we really do see them oftentimes as being separate. So really depends on your belief system how separate you keep them from you. Now, this idea of prejudice, I think, ends up being an important one when we look at how people treat other people. In general, I don't think necessarily stereotypes are inherently bad. And I know people will argue with me. But I think a stereotype is something that we might look at and make an assessment of immediately. I think you need to be aware of your stereotypes. So I think that they probably are going to exist in people, because initially when we meet somebody, we're going to automatically create a schemata for that person. We're going to automatically categorize them. We're going to automatically determine maybe if they're safe or not safe. And you're going to oftentimes place a stereotype on that person based on that experience. So we look at those elements of stereotypes and how people interact with each other, and they're going to be oftentimes an initial assessment that you make of a person. I think the key is that you choose to acknowledge that you have a stereotype, that you might have placed a stereotype on the person, and then choose to meet that person for who they really are. So that means, okay, that was my initial impression of the person. Now let me get to know them, and how does that look? Another thing I think that helps with stereotypes is if you meet people and you interact with people that you might normally have not related to, you're going to actually change the way that you stereotype somebody. You might have changed a negative stereotype into a positive one. One that the book mentions in here, and I don't have it in this current chapter, but I think it's in the last one. He mentions Gran Torino with Clint Eastwood, and he talks about initially his belief systems about the neighbors and the neighborhood, and learning to interact with them allows him to see them in a different light, maybe expanding his belief systems about who people are. I'd like to say that we can suspend them and not have them, but I think to some degree, just because we've interacted with somebody before, we might have an experience. I know even for me, sometimes I have stereotypes about names. So if I had a negative experience with someone years before, and I was like, oh, people that have this name make me think this. So you might have a certain experience with someone based on what their name is. And I mean, it's silly, but it happens. Sometimes we will make judgments or make decisions about somebody based on their name. So it just happens to be part of our belief systems. And then a prejudice is going to be rigid attitudes towards a group. So prejudice, I think, ends up being an issue. We really do have this idea that everybody who's in this group looks like this. Everybody who's in this group has this particular attitude, this particular belief. This is who they are. And you're stating it like, this is it. Again, I think the way around that is interaction and creating some different experiences around people. But let's look at the stereotype content model, and there's two pieces that you can look at here. One is benevolent, and the other one is hostile. So benevolent occurs when people of a particular group are seen as inferior, but they're also seen as friendly but competent. So they're not necessarily, they're like not important, they're ignored. And then the hostile ones are negative, and then the other people are seen as unfriendly and incompetent. Again, prejudice isn't a great place to hang out. These stereotypes are on the negative side for sure, these two, benevolent and hostile. And this idea that somebody is intelligent or not intelligent, friendly or unfriendly, based on a categorization that someone has placed upon them isn't really fair. So if it's, whether it's an actual culture or a different culture that you've come from, or a culture that you might belong to, whether that means if someone's coming from a deaf culture, perhaps someone might make an assumption about them, and there's no difference in intelligence level. It just means that they can't hear. So a lot of times people will place ideologies upon them about who they are and their intelligence and things because they're not able to hear. So definitely a difference there as far as how people can be perceived and choices that we have around that. So we don't have to make those decisions. You can make a different decision. Someone doesn't have to be unintelligent or whatever. It's just, isn't that interesting that a person's from another culture and let me relate to them as who they are. Let me relate to them as a human being, as a person. And if you have stereotypes and you have belief systems around it, just acknowledge it so that you can work around it. All right, that's what I have for this one.